I apologize for being late. I woke up early. I had everything go wrong today. And then I got here, and I left my laptop at home. So then I had to email stuff and stuff. So I would have had more handouts for you, but I just did not have the time to download them and print them and everything. So I also have to thank my wife, who forgives my trespasses, because she is running for my laptop. We have a PowerPoint this morning. So I am thankful for her and her patience. We are going to be in Leviticus with the teens, young adults study. We've been going through Leviticus, and we're going to kind of continue that. Each one is a standalone, so we'll do a little bit of review. We're mainly going to be in Leviticus chapters 23 and 25 this morning. And in our previous studies on chapters, at least for Fellowship Hall, we focused on really so far in this last section, which is the Holiness Code. The Holiness Code covers chapters 17 through 26. And so far in that section here in Leviticus, in trying to answer this question of how does a holy God live with unholy people, giving this answer of, well, there's the priesthood, and there's the Day of Atonement that helps out with that, and there's all of these other things. Well, part of it is holy living, right? And so far we've seen looked at holiness and sexual conduct, which covered basically that marriage and sex to a close relative, or homosexuality or bestiality, were all condemned under this Holiness Code. And then last week we looked at holiness and social conduct, or I guess more plainly put, how to be a holy neighbor, right? And some of those principles, what would be some principles of things I shouldn't do if I want to be a holy neighbor? What would you say, just generally speaking, things I should not do? Steal, that was in there. You shouldn't steal things, right? What else? Yep, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't lie. Some others that were in there, you shouldn't cheat, pervert justice, slander others. And the basic principle, which is going to sound familiar, was love your neighbor as yourself. Right? That's something that Jesus repeats in the New Testament. And then there were some special concerns right at the end of that text there in chapter 19. Well, it's throughout chapter 19, but that we need to, if we're going to be holy neighbors, have some special concern for the poor. We need to have some special concern for the foreigner in our land, or for the disabled and the elderly. And as we go beyond that text into what we're looking at this morning, we're going to see it turn in a different direction. Today we're going to look at a summary of these different feasts and holy days and festivals and holy years from Leviticus chapter 23 and chapter 25. Let's start in chapter 23 and verse 3. And what we're going to do, first we're going to move very quickly through them, and then we're going to talk about them. So I just kind of want to introduce them to us. We're not going to look at a lot of details within there, but then we're going to see some principles of them that apply to us. So the first one is the Sabbath, right? This is one that Jesus talked about a lot, right? It's one that he broke supposedly a lot. But you can see he can defend himself each time. Chapter 23 and verse 3 says, "For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings." So there's this Sabbath day. How often did this happen? Every what? Every 7 days, right? It was the seventh day of the week, which for us would be Saturday, right? And it was this weekly day of rest and worship. So there was something that they did weekly, and then we're going to see some that are annual. And there were 3 major festivals with various special days associated with them. And the first is the day of Passover, right? And the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is in chapter 23 and verse 4 through 8. The Passover took place on the 14th day of the last month of the year. The first month of the year, which for us would be around March or April. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread began the next day, and it lasted for a whole week. And so this description of this was the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread reenacted what? What did it reenact? Yeah, the last plague, right? Where you had the death of the firstborn. But if you put the blood on the doorposts and on your mantle, it was mantle, then the angel of the Lord would pass over and save you from that plague, right? From the death of your child. And so it was this reenactment of the salvation of the Israelites, not only from that, but also from Egypt, right? Because it's that moment, that day, that finally Pharaoh said, "Get out of here. I don't want anything to do with you anymore." Right? You can leave. And so we see their hasty departure directly after this moment. Another annual feast and day that they would have is the Day of First Fruits and the Feast of the Weeks, which we call the harvest or the Pentecost. We see that when Peter's preaching on the day of Pentecost. Right? This is this time. And it was only one day long. We see it described in chapter 23, verses 9 through 22. And it was to take place on the day after the Sabbath. So what would that be? It's a Sunday, right? Just before the barley and the flax harvest began, and it's because of that sometimes the day varied. Right? Apparently, in the year Jesus died, it happened with the Sunday of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It was a one-day festival that took place 7 weeks after offering the first fruit, again, which also happened on a Sunday. In the New Testament, they call it the Pentecost. But this Day of First Fruits, it inaugurated, or it began, or dedicated the harvest. And the Feast of Weeks celebrated the conclusion of the harvest. So you have one that starts the harvest and one that ends the harvest. Well, celebrates the ending of it, right? Because the work is done. If you know of somebody that works on a farm, or you ever worked on a farm, harvest time, you're busy, right? And at the end, it's that sigh of relief. We're finally through it, right? And then you have to start it all over again. Then that third annual festival is the Day of Trumpets, or the Day of Atonement, sometimes called the Feast of Booths. It's recorded in the remainder of chapter 23. And you'd have these trumpets that were blown on the first day of the 7th month, and it marked the end of the summer and the beginning of a special holy season where you have the Day of Atonement that took place on the 14th day of the 7th month, around September or October. And the Feast of Booths began the next day and lasted for a week. And so it was this annual cleansing of the tabernacle, where it reenacts, Israel's time in the wilderness. Now there were some, so we've looked at weekly, we've looked at annually. There's some that were more spread out, let's say it that way, right? They were less frequent, I guess is the word I'm looking for, such as the Sabbath year. So this happened once every 7th year. This is in chapter 25, verses 1 through 7. And it was a year-long rest for the land where, this land's been going for 6 years, and the 7th year I'm going to let it rest. I'm going to let it renew whatever it needs to renew, right? So you wouldn't harvest anything, you wouldn't cultivate anything on that land, you would just let whatever grows there grow. And that's what you would do. And then you also have the year of Jubilee. What happened on the year of Jubilee? Who can tell me? Yeah, a couple things, right? If you had sold yourself into slavery, or you had a bond, right, you'd at this time be free. And so this was a special Sabbath year, which happened once every 50 years, which was a time of release or a time of liberty. And so not only would some of the slaves go free, but the land would return to its original family. That way you wouldn't have the tribal lands start to get mixed up. And so that's what you would have happen. Now, yeah. Huh. Yeah, that's the only year of Jubilee we find. As far as I'm aware, there's certainly not anything. You're not going to find the word Catholic in there, right? Thank you, dear. That's my wife, everyone. Yeah. All right. So, looking at all of this, let's see some principles that span across this, right? Because I don't need to know all the specifics of the year of Jubilee, because like you said, it's not a Christian thing, right? It was a Jewish thing. But there are some principles that span all of these that apply to us, and that's what we've been trying to do as we've gone through Leviticus. Because do I need to know what specific foods are clean and unclean? No. Do I need to know that that represented that the people needed to be separate from the people around them? Yes, because that means I also need to be holy and separate from the world around me. And that's what the clean and unclean food laws represented. And so as we look at these, the first principle that spans all of these is that of rest. Right? What's the main one we think of when we think of rest, right, that they celebrated? What was the day of rest? The Sabbath, right? Right? That was the day designated for them to rest, because on the 7th day God rested. Right? Notice as we go back, we'll read all of these and see how it spans not just the Sabbath, but the others as well. Starting in Leviticus 23, says, for 6 days, in verse 3, work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest. Right? Notice going down to verse 7, this is talking about the Passover. It says, on the first day you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall not do any laborious work. So the Passover involved rest. And actually, if you look at towards the end of verse 8, it reestablishes that. It says, you shall not do any laborious work. For the Feast of Weeks, skip down to verse 21. Oops, I skipped a chapter. Chapter 23 and verse 21. It says, on this very day you shall make a proclamation as well. You are to have a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work. Yeah, well, that's part of the Sabbath, right? This isn't part of the Sabbath. This was a separate festival altogether. And so the rest went beyond that. Yes. So the Sabbath day, you would rest. But there were other days that you were to rest as well. If we look at verse 24 and 25, this is for the Day of Trumpets. It says, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st of the year, you shall have a rest, a reminder by blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work, but you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. Notice if we skip down to verse 28. Actually, somebody read for me verse 28 through 32. This is for the Day of Atonement. 28 through 32. All right. So this especially focused on rest, right? The Day of Atonement. If we look down in verse 35, this is for the Feast of Booths. It says, on the first day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. If we go over to chapter 25 and verse 4, this is the Sabbath year. It says, during the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard. You're not to work that land. Right? And then finally, verse 11, the year of Jubilee. You shall have the 50th year as a Jubilee, and you shall not sow, nor harvest its aftergrowth, nor gather grapes from its untrimmed vines. So every holy day, every festival, every holy year is explicitly connected to the idea of rest. Why do you think rest is such a prominent idea in these texts? What do you think? Why is it so important in these days and feasts and festivals? right? Renewal, right? So I just joined the InShape gym just this last week. Haven't started going. We're starting to go, tomorrow, me and Shannon, and we signed Devin up too. And they can hear me still, Megan. Megan's like, you got to get back in the camera. And I was building my workout plan, and guess what I had to build in there? A day of rest, because your body has to recover. And Sunday is my day of rest, where I'm not doing anything. I might do a light walk. That's it. And even in the middle of the week, I have another day that it's just stretching, working on sore muscles, and just really light cardio. Just another, maybe a brisk walk, and that's it. Because you have to let renewal happen, right? And that's important in our lives, right? So physically, there is a reason for this, right? God recognized the need for his people to stop working and rest on a regular basis, right? One day out of 7, selected weeks out of the year as well. But also, not just physically, but logically, it makes sense, right? God recognized the need for the land to rest. You got to give the land a break too. Yeah. And if you just keep doing that over and over, yeah. That's that physical rest. Yeah. And then for the land, it needed time to rest, right? It needed time to renew. I was just going to say, we use chemicals to kind of supplement the rest, because we can test and see what does it need to get back into it, so you're not having to work and work and work at it, right? But spiritually, there needed to be this rest, and certainly this is the most important. God's demand for people to stop working and rest is connected to something spiritual, right? We've got to trust God for the next day. I've got to trust that God will maintain my crops. I've got to trust that God is going to take care of, providing food for me, since I haven't had a chance to hunt or fish this day, right? That it's time to trust in God, and sometimes it lasted for a week. And so, for example, the Passover and the feast often, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, reenacted the salvation as they went out from Egypt. But then as we go through this, we see that they were to rely upon God, the one who saved them, and that he was going to continually deliver them, right? It's about trusting God, not our own well-being. All right, notice somebody read verse 20 through 22 of chapter 25. That's big trust right there, isn't it? Now, if I have 7 pieces of land, right, and I rotate through them, so each one has that Sabbath year of rest, that's not that big of a deal. But if I only have 1 piece of land, and now I have to not plant or not harvest for a whole year? What am I going to eat? God says, don't worry, I will provide. But that takes trust. That really shows you that you can rely upon God, right? If you go through that. Yeah. Yeah. Yep, it would rot and you'd be stuck without food. You had to trust that God would provide the next day, right? And so this natural concern is, what are we going to eat, right, if we don't work the fields? And God's response is essentially, I need you to trust me, right? Why do a lot of people today never, take a day off, much less a week? Right? Some people just work themselves to death, right? Never trusting that God can sustain them. And they believe that they've got to work nonstop in order to succeed or in order to get ahead. And the command to rest in Leviticus is this direct rebuke of our trust in ourselves. Right? We have to trust in something other than ourselves. The second recurring theme in these instructions is this call for, my version says a holy convocation. The NIV says holy assembly. Did anybody else have something different as we were going through all those verses? You notice there was to be this holy convocation, and you shall do no laborious work. For one example, going back to chapter 23 and verse 3, we won't read through all these verses again. But he says, for 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings. And so during each of these holy days or seasons, but not the years, the people were to hold this holy assembly, right? What do you think this was, this holy convocation? How would you describe it? What's it seem like? Yeah, it seems to be a special worship assembly that took place, right, during this time. There was, one that took place on the Sabbath day every week, but there were special ones that took place, on the Day of Atonement, or on the Feast of Weeks, or on the Day of Trumpets, on the, Festival of Booths, during the Passover. And so it was this special worship assembly, and based on information in Leviticus and some other texts as well, it included sacrifice. It included the public reading of Scripture. It included worship. We find that example in Nehemiah. And some performance or reciting of the Psalms and the prayers. And so that was specifically associated with the Passover. Why do you think there's such an emphasis on this holy assembly? Yeah, so you can focus on, right, if we're celebrating the Passover and we're resting and we've come together, right, it makes sense to worship, to celebrate the God that delivered us, right? To celebrate that delivery, that provision that took place. So there's that focus. And the various holy seasons celebrated the specific events in God's, or in the life of God's people, right? The beginning of the harvest, right? Thank you, we have seed to plant, right? Or seed or fruit to start to harvest it. You have the end of the harvest. Thank you for all that you blessed us with. Right? That would be especially meaningful if the next year you weren't going to be planting anything because it was that year of rest for the land. Deliverance from Egypt. And so you have these assemblies, these worship times that are associated with those times that we're reminding God's people who God is, right? And why we serve Him. The rigors of human life sometimes require us to reaffirm that the Lord is our God. Right? Sometimes we get so caught up that we try to take control of our own life. And we need to sometimes stop and say, yes, oh God, you are my God, and I will ever praise you. Right? We need to stop and sing to the Lord sometimes, to remember through worship. And certainly not least, the Lord is worthy of worship. That's why we stop and worship Him. That's why it's included in these times. You're going to rest from all that you're doing and remember that God is worthy of this worship. God is worthy of this praise. Do you think there's a connection between the principle of rest and the command to worship, to gather to worship? Do you think there's a connection between rest and worship? It's kind of like, okay, it's the Sabbath day. I can't do anything today, right? Well, might as well worship, right? It leaves you open to worship, right? Versus if it's a day you could harvest and it's the day you have fruit falling from the tree that you could be getting right now, your mind is easily occupied thinking, I'm losing money right now, worshiping God. And certainly that shouldn't be our attitude, right? It certainly has a connection that the only time, especially in ancient Israel, is going to have time to go and worship is going to be on a day of rest, because any other day they're going to be busy. And so they go together, rest and worship. Right? Rest allows a person to trust in God and not in self, and worship affirms that need to trust in God. Now, go into the New Testament as we kind of close things up this morning. Specifically addresses the issue of holy days. Somebody read Galatians 4 and verse 10 for us. Galatians 4, verse 10. All right. Short but sweet. Right? Now, the letter to the Galatians is written in response to the Jewish Christians telling the Gentile Christians they've got to keep all the Jewish stuff in order to be saved. Right? And so you've got these Gentile Christians who never needed to celebrate the Passover before, who never needed to participate in the Feast of Weeks or in the Days of Trumpets, and now they're feeling like, well, we've got to do all this stuff. And Paul writes and says, you don't need to do all of that. But you can if you want. You can celebrate these things if you want. But there's no need for these as far as it's related to salvation. And these Galatian Christians are struggling with certain teachers who claim that they've got to obey the law of Moses in order to be saved. And so Paul challenges this. Notice down, if we continue that text in verse 11, he says, I fear for you that perhaps I have labored over you in vain. Right? So they've begun to keep these special holy days and seasons because they believed we've got to do that in order to be in obedience with the law. And Paul corrects them. Right? He says, you're under no obligation to keep the special holy days or the festivals as part of obedience to the Lord. If we go over to Romans chapter 14, talking about principles of conscience. Someone read verse 5 and 6 for us. Romans 14, verse 5 and 6. All right, so the Roman church may have been a bit different than the Galatian church, right? It's still far removed from the area of the Jews, but it seems to have contained both Jews and Gentiles in it. And so notice how Paul deals with the issue of these holy days with them, right? He says if a person chooses to celebrate a special holy day, he says that's fine, right? But you should be convinced in your conscience that that's what you need to do. Right? Again, here there's no obligation to observe these holy days and seasons, but it's an option for those who desire to do so. Right? And there may be some of us who come from maybe different denominations or different religions where a special day was part of that practice, and could somebody that comes to the Lord from Judaism continue to participate in the Sabbath day? And to say, I'm going to set aside Saturday as this day of rest, and I'm still going to focus on God, even though I'm worshiping God on Sunday. Is there anything wrong with that? Exactly. Right? And Paul would say no. But now, if that person started to say, hey, you need to celebrate the Sabbath, that's where Paul's saying, no, that's not how this works, right? If you want to consider something as a holy day, right, whether you want to celebrate Christmas as a religious holiday or not, that's on you. But if you start to force that on people, then that becomes a different issue, right? And so we have different, what we would call holy days or seasons than what we see within Leviticus, but it's still relevant, right? And we certainly have different than what we find in the early church, right, here in Romans. And so then how do we correlate Paul's statement in Galatians with the Romans? There is no obligation to keep these holy days. And those who are teaching an obligation, he's saying those people are in grave danger, right? Because you're commanding something that God hasn't commanded. You're given the New Testament teaching on this. What do you think are some of the important principles that we should learn from the holy days and the seasons, that we see back in ancient Israel? What do you think? What should we take with us? Yeah. And that includes rest, right? Like Israel, we need to learn how to rest. We need to learn to stop depending on ourselves and to take time to trust in God that He will provide many different places. He says, if I care for the smallest and cheapest of the birds, how much more do you think I care for you? If I care for the grass that comes today and is burnt tomorrow, how much more do you think I care for you? We need to learn to trust in the one that cares for us, and that if he's going to uphold the grass that dies in a day, he certainly is going to want to uphold us, the pinnacle of his creation. And we need to stop depending on ourselves. One important way we can do this is by taking that day off to rest and to be with our families, as Shirley was saying. We need to learn to stop working and rest. But also, one more thing I want to leave you with. Like Israel, we need regular times of worship. Right? That's what we also saw with all of those holy days. And like I said, we weren't getting bogged down in all the details of them. But we need regular times of worship. Right? We need times to refocus our lives upon God and simply to worship God and celebrate him and who he is and what he's done for us. Any other thoughts, questions, comments by anybody on these days or feasts or festivals? Or well, there's a lot to remember, but we also have to remember that Leviticus was given to them not as a rule book. It was not given, you have to keep this and this and this and this. It was, I want to live with you. But there's certain things that have to take place in order for that to happen. And the very first thing that he gives them, because he's a gracious God, is sacrifice. He understands they're not going to do it perfectly. And he doesn't expect them to do it perfectly. And so before he gives them any of the rules, any of the laws, right, other than the Ten Commandments, he says, when you sin, do this. When you want to celebrate me, do this. When this happens, you can sacrifice in this way. Because God wants to make provision for us. He wants to forgive us. And he understands that we can't live perfectly holy. And so we do tend to look at Leviticus very much like this. Look at all the commands that they had to follow. God understood that they couldn't follow them perfectly. But he says, if you want to live with me and I want to live with you, then it's going to take sacrifices when you fall short. We're going to need a priesthood because you can't approach me. We're going to need a way to cleanse my dwelling, the Day of Atonement. We're going to need to separate you from the people around you. That's the clean and the unclean laws. And we're going to need to understand that you need to be holy because I'm holy, and that's going to involve holy living. And this is what that looks like. Right? Try to do this. When you don't, sacrifice. When you need to talk to me, go to the priest. And that's just what he does with us, right? We've got laws that we're supposed to follow. But he understands that we're not perfect, and so he sent his son. And that's why 1 John says, when you're walking in the light, his blood cleanses us from all unrighteousness. There's a way to walk in the light that is not perfect. It does include sin sometimes, but it's a way that leads to salvation, and they had a way that led to salvation. I think that's important to remember. And the more I study Leviticus, the more I see that. Because growing up, you're like, this is a lot of laws. But it's a lot of grace as well. All right, we'll go ahead and end right there, and we will get ready for our holy convocation.